What
told you to
happens
pack
when a
up.
city
This is your
officer
final
crosses
warning.
a line, thinking he's untouchable, only to discover the man he's been bullying is someone who holds the key to his fate? Imagine a street vendor, just trying to make a living, facing the worst kind of power abuse, until one day, that same vendor stands tall, revealing his true identity, and the entire system crumbles before him. Is it too late to fix things, or will justice prevail? Comment wherever you're watching from. Drop your city or country below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful human stories. It was the first frost of winter on Linden Avenue, the chill in the air making the scent of street food all the more intoxicating. The streets, though busy, had that early morning quiet to them, almost like a whisper before the roar of the city would pick up. People rushed, bundled up, walking briskly, their breath visible in the air as the sun slowly climbed over the horizon. At the far end of the street, a small metal cart sat proudly, the heart of a humble operation. Gabe Morales, or simply Gabe to the people who passed by, stood behind it, flipping churros into a pan of sizzling oil. His routine was practiced, each motion like the choreography of a well-rehearsed play. He'd been doing this for years, ever since his mother had passed, leaving the cart, and with it, the dream she had for him. A simple one: work hard, help people, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to rise above. Gabe wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. But he had something a lot of people didn't have: peace. And that peace came from the fact that he loved what he did, no matter how little money came in. He gave out warm churros and hot cocoa to the people who needed them the most. Construction workers heading to the job site, commuters who hadn't yet had their coffee, kids rushing to school. To them, Gabe wasn't just a vendor. He was a slice of comfort in the harsh city morning. His cart was a simple setup, a metal frame with a sign that read warm churros and hot cocoa. First pot free if you're here early. The sign was hand-painted, old but sturdy. The warmth of the churros, combined with the smell of cocoa, gave the street an almost festive feeling every morning. Gabe knew the regulars by face, sometimes even by name. They didn't come for the food. They came because they knew they would get something more, a bit of kindness, a bit of warmth, and a smile that made the early morning grind feel a little easier. As Gabe placed another churro in a paper bag for an elderly woman on her way to the bus stop, he noticed something strange: a patrol car that wasn't passing by. It had stopped right across the street. Gabe paused for a moment, his instincts kicking in. Something about this car felt off. The officer inside was still in the car, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, staring straight ahead. Gabe couldn't see his face clearly, but he didn't need to. He knew. Every vendor on this street knew the signs. The patrol car, the officer inside, the way the morning felt. It was a beginning of trouble. Gabe turned back to his cart, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling in his stomach. But the feeling didn't go away. He could feel the officer's gaze on him, even from a distance. It wasn't curiosity. It was something else. Something that made Gabe uneasy. He continued to serve his customers, maintaining his usual calm demeanor. Then, just as the woman who bought the churros was walking away, the patrol car's engine revved to life. The officer had stepped out. Officer Kurt Doyle was tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that seemed permanently set in a scowl. His uniform was pristine, his boots gleaming. He looked like the kind of officer who believed that a badge was all he needed to make the rules. He didn't bother to greet Gabe. Instead, he marched straight toward the cart, his steps heavy and deliberate, like a man with a purpose and a sense of superiority. "Morning, Morales," Doyle said with a half-smile, as if Gabe was already in trouble without him having to say why. Gabe looked up from his cart and smiled politely. "Morning, officer. How can I help you?" Doyle didn't return the smile. Instead, he glanced at the small metal cart with distaste. "What do you think you're doing here, Morales?" The question caught Gabe off guard. He had been on this corner for years. His permit was up to date, and he was well within city regulations. He glanced at the officer, and then at the empty space beside the cart. "Just making churros, officer. Same as every morning." Gabe said, his voice calm, but a slight edge to it now. He had been on the street long enough to know when someone was looking to cause trouble. Doyle took a step closer, his body language aggressive. "I'm talking about the city ordinance. You're blocking the sidewalk." You're creating an obstruction. He gestured toward the sidewalk, though there was plenty of space for people to walk around. Gabe felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had read all the rules. He knew he was in the right. I'm not blocking anything, officer. The sidewalk's wide enough for anyone pass, Gabe said, holding his ground. But Doyle wasn't listening. Doesn't matter. You've been here long enough. Time to pack it up. There it was, the familiar power play. It wasn't about the rules anymore. It was about authority, about showing who was in charge. Gabe could feel it in the air. The street was getting quiet. People started to notice the confrontation. A few vendors looked up, glancing nervously between Gabe and Doyle. A man across the street stopped pushing his shopping cart and stared. But nobody moved. Nobody dared to step in. I'm not going anywhere, officer, Gabe said, his voice steady, but there was a weight to it now. It wasn't just about his cart. It was about standing up for what was right. Doyle's eyes narrowed. You don't have a choice in this, Morales. I'll call it in, and you'll be off the street for good. Gabe stood tall, his gaze unflinching. You can call it in all you want. I've got a permit, and I'm well within my rights. Gabe took a deep breath, and the words he had been holding back came out steady and calm. I'm not going anywhere, officer. Doyle's expression darkened. He took a step forward, crossing the line. You're making this harder than it needs to be. He reached toward Gabe's cart, his hand outstretched, ready to move it. But Gabe moved first. Without hesitation, Gabe placed his hand on the cart's metal handle, blocking Doyle's hand. Don't touch my cart, officer. Gabe's voice had dropped a notch. It was the first time all morning his voice had carried that edge. For a moment, Doyle froze. Then his face twisted with frustration. You don't know who you're messing with, Morales. I'll make sure you regret this. Gabe's hand tightened around the cart handle. I don't think you realize who you're talking to. Doyle looked at him, confused, but the flash of anger didn't go unnoticed. Gabe's gaze remained steady. What are you talking about? Doyle said, his voice now cold. Gabe stood there for a second, waiting, almost as if he were choosing his words carefully. Then he looked Doyle straight in the eye. I'm the mayor's brother. The words hit Doyle like a physical blow. He blinked. His eyes darted from Gabe to the crowd, to the street, to his own reflection in the side mirror of his patrol car, almost as if he were trying to understand the weight of the revelation. The street fell silent. For a moment, nobody moved. Doyle took a slow step back, his face shifting from confusion to disbelief. You're the mayor's brother? Gabe didn't flinch. He simply nodded. Yes, I am. The crowd, which had been silently watching, began to stir. The tension in the air shifted. A few people exchanged glances, a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Some began to pull out their phones, recording the moment, though none dared to speak. Doyle seemed to lose his composure for the first time. He took a step back and looked around, his eyes scanning the street as if looking for confirmation that he hadn't just made the worst mistake of his career. Gabe, now fully aware of the impact his words had, stood taller. He didn't raise his voice. There was no need. His calm, unyielding presence spoke volumes. Officer, I suggest you call your superior. Gabe said quietly, but with the kind of authority that made Doyle's hands twitch. Doyle opened his mouth to speak, but stopped. He looked at Gabe again, clearly unsure what to do next. The man who had been bullying and intimidating street vendors was now standing face to face with someone who could bring his entire career crashing down. But Gabe wasn't finished yet. Part 3, the turning point. Officer Doyle stood motionless for a moment, trying to process what Gabe had just said. He had heard about the mayor's family, of course, but he had never expected to cross paths with someone so ordinary. Someone with a street vendor cart, no less. It was hard to reconcile the picture of a humble Chuo vendor with the kind of power and influence Gabe had just revealed. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. A few of the bystanders had pulled out their phones, but nobody spoke. Gabe didn't need to say anything more. The revelation hung in the air like the frost that had begun to form on the sidewalk. The power dynamic had shifted. Doyle, however, seemed reluctant to acknowledge the shift. His face flushed, his jaw clenched, and his body language shifted from aggression to a strange kind of self-consciousness. He clearly didn't know how to back down from this confrontation. He had been in control, but now he wasn't sure who held the cards. Gabe, on the other hand, remained calm, calmer than he'd felt in a long time. It wasn't about the cart, the food, or the street corner anymore. It was about justice. "Listen, officer," Gabe said, keeping his voice steady. "I don't want trouble. I just want to do my job. But when someone abuses their power, when they try to intimidate me in front of the people who depend on me, that's not something I can just ignore." Doyle took a deep breath, his eyes darting between Gabe and the growing crowd of onlookers. He hadn't anticipated this level of resistance. He hadn't expected Gabe to call him out with such quiet authority. For a moment, he just stood there, unsure what to do next. But then something snapped inside him. "You think I'm intimidated by you?" Doyle sneered, shaking his head. He took another step forward, as though trying to reclaim some sense of control. "You think just because you're the mayor's brother, you can avoid the law?" Gabe stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not avoiding anything. I'm following the law. You're the one who's been twisting it to suit your own agenda." The words hit Doyle like a slap. His face reddened and his fists clenched at his sides. He took a step back, clearly struggling to regain his composure. This wasn't how he had planned for the morning to go. This wasn't how he had planned for his day to unfold. "I'm not going to let you get away with this," Doyle muttered under his breath, his voice tight with frustration. "I'll have you arrested. I'll get you off the street one way or another." But Gabe wasn't afraid. He didn't flinch or back away. Instead, he held his ground, his calm demeanor only making Doyle angrier. "You don't scare me, officer," Gabe said, his tone even, "and I think you'll find that try to intimidate me or anyone else on this street isn't going to end the way you expect." The words hung between them like an electric current. And for a moment, there was nothing but silence. The crowd was waiting for one of them to break the stalemate, to make the next move. Just as Gabe thought Doyle might finally back off, the officer reached for his radio. "I'm calling this in." Doyle barked, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and panic. "You're going to pay for this." Gabe raised an eyebrow, an almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. This was it. This was the moment when everything changed. "Call whoever you want, officer," Gabe said, his voice a calm whisper. "But know this is bigger than you. This is about more than me. It's about how we treat each other. And how much longer we can allow people like you to act like this with impunity." Just as Doyle was about to respond, a voice interrupted, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Is there a problem here?" The voice came from the other side of the street, and it was unmistakable. A tall figure, dressed in a sharp black suit, walked toward them with confidence. His gaze swept over the scene, over Gabe, over Doyle, and over the crowd of onlookers who had gathered to witness the confrontation. His presence commanded attention. He was a man who didn't just walk into a room. He walked into the world, making it move around him. Gabe's heart skipped a beat. It was his older brother, Mayor Felipe Morales. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as the mayor of Linden City approached. Gabe had to suppress a smile. He hadn't expected Felipe to show up like this, but his timing couldn't have been more perfect. Doyle turned, his face draining of color as he realized who had just walked onto the scene. The cocky smirk he had been wearing moments ago vanished, replaced by a look of disbelief and fear. "Mayor Morales," Doyle stammered, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" Felipe's gaze flicked over to his younger brother, then back to Doyle. His eyes narrowed. There was no kindness in them, not yet. Anyway, just a sharp, measured anger that only came from someone who understood how the system worked. "I was just about to ask you the same thing, officer." Felipe's voice was steady, controlled. "Why are you harassing my brother?" Doyle opened his mouth to respond, but the words failed him. He couldn't bring himself to answer. Not now. Not when the mayor was standing right in front of him, his own personal brand of power radiating from him like an electric current. Gabe watched as the scene unfolded. His brother was always good at this, at putting people in their place with nothing more than a look. He had done it all his life, ever since they were kids. Felipe had learned the hard way that sometimes, to make change, you had to use the very tools that the system gave you. I see, Felipe said, his voice still calm, but laced with venom. You've been bullying my brother here. Try and make his life harder than it needs to be. What's your excuse? Doyle didn't have an answer. He simply stood there, eyes darting nervously, his thoughts scattered. I was just doing my job, Doyle mumbled, but it was clear his confidence was slipping away, piece by piece. Doing your job? Felipe repeated, his voice colder now. You're using your position to intimidate a citizen who is well within his rights to be here. You're not doing your job, you're abusing your authority. The word hit Doyle harder than any slap could have. He blinked rapidly, his face reddening as the weight of his actions came crashing down on him. Felipe turned to a crowd of bystanders, who had been watching the entire scene unfold. You see this, he said, his voice carrying across the street. This is what happens when power is abused. When people like Officer Doyle take their badges and use them to oppress others. We can't let this happen anymore. The crowd began to murmur, some nodding in agreement, others slowly stepping forward. Gabe felt a rush of pride swelling inside him. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. The people had seen the injustice of themselves, and now they were ready to speak out. Doyle, realizing he had lost control of the situation, looked around desperately, trying to salvage some dignity. But it was too late. The truth was out. Gabe was no longer just a vendor. He was a mayor's brother, and he wasn't going to stand by while this officer or anyone else bullied people on the street. Felipe turned to Gabe, his expression softening. Are you okay? He asked, placing a hand on his younger brother's shoulder. Gabe smiled, a small but powerful smile that spoke volumes. I'm fine, thanks to you. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings and media coverage. The story of what had happened on Linden Avenue quickly spread throughout the city. News outlets picked it up, and before long, it had gone viral. The confrontation between Officer Doyle and Gabe Morales, the mayor's brother, became a symbol of the systemic issues that had been plaguing the city for years. Felipe, now fully aware of how deep the corruption ran, took action immediately. Officer Doyle was suspended pending investigation, and the city launched an official review of his conduct. Public accountability became the order of the day. Gabe's life returned to normal after the dust settled, but it wasn't the same. The event had sparked a series of conversations about power, justice, and fairness. Conversations that had been long overdue. Felipe, as the mayor, pushed forward with reforms in law enforcement, ensuring that officers were held to a higher standard of conduct. He introduced new policies aimed at preventing abuse of power and making the streets safer for everyone. Gabe stood outside his cart one morning, the familiar scent of churros filling the air once more. But this time it was different. The people who passed by smiled a little brighter, nodded a little more enthusiastically. He had stood up to injustice, and won. But more than that, Gabe knew that this fight wasn't just about him. It was about the people, the regular citizens, the ones who lived in the shadows of power, whose voices were so often silenced. Now they had a chance to speak. As Gabe handed a chuo to a young boy, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had done what he had set out to do. He had made a difference. The media frenzy surrounding the confrontation between Officer Doyle and Gabe Morales did not die down after the story broke. It spread like wildfire, and within days, Gabe found himself at the center of a much larger storm. News outlets, social media platforms, and even local influencers were talking about the event. It had become a flashpoint in the city, a symbol of the power imbalance between law enforcement and the common people. Public opinion was divided. On one hand, many people cheered for Gabe and his brother, Mayor Felipe Morales. The story resonated with those who had long felt oppressed, the ones who had experienced the harsh side of authority but never had the voice or the power to challenge it. Gabe had become an unintentional hero, the face of a growing movement to demand justice for those without a voice. But on the other hand, there were those who resented the Morales family, especially Felipe. Doyle supporters, along with those who believed that the mayor's brother was abusing his position, began to raise questions about whether Gabe's actions were truly justified. They argued that Gabe had taken advantage of his brother's position, using it as a shield to avoid following the rules. Some even accused Gabe of embarrassing the police force and undermining the work they did to keep the streets safe. Tensions were high, and the political ramifications were impossible to ignore. Felipe could feel the weight of the public scrutiny. As the mayor, he had a duty to keep the city united, and this incident had polarized his constituents. The pressure to resolve the matter swiftly mounted as people began to take sides. The quiet support Gabe had gained in the streets was at odds with the political factions now circling above. One late evening, after a long day of media interviews and political meetings, Gabe sat on the couch in his apartment. The evening air was cool, and he could hear the distant hum of the city through his window. He hadn't expected any of this. The attention, the drama, the consequences. He had just wanted to make a living, to honor his mother's memory, and to stand up for what was right. But now, it felt like everything had changed. The phone rang. Gabe glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello." Gabe's voice was calm, but there was a tension in the air. "Gabe." The voice on the other end was low, quiet, but unmistakable. It was Evelyn Hart, the quiet yet sharp city council member who'd been allied to Felipe for years. "Evelyn, what's going on?" Gabe asked, his heart rate quickening. "We need to talk." Evelyn's voice was serious, even urgent. "Meet me at the old diner on 5th Street in 1 hour. There's something you need to know." Before Gabe could ask anything more, she hung up. His mind raced. Something wasn't right. Evelyn had always been an advocate for fairness, but the urgency in her tone made him uneasy. He trusted her, but the city was teetering on the edge of something bigger than he had imagined. Gabe didn't know what was coming, but he couldn't ignore it. He grabbed his jacket and left his apartment, his thoughts swirling. The diner was a small, run-down place tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was the kind of place that time had forgotten. Its red vinyl booths cracked and faded, the smell of greasy food and old coffee in the air. Gabe didn't think much of it as he entered, scanning the room. There was only one other person sitting at the counter, and the place was nearly empty. Evelyn sat in a booth near the back, her eyes scanning the door before they landed on him. "You came. Good," Evelyn said as Gabe sat down. Her tone was still calm, but there was an edge to it, something unspoken hanging in the air. "What's going on, Evelyn?" Gabe asked, leaning in. "Why the secrecy?" Evelyn looked around quickly before speaking in a lower voice. "You need to be careful. There are forces at play here that you don't know about." Gabe frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I've been digging into the fallout from the incident, Gabe, and it's worse than you think." Evelyn's voice dropped, and she looked around once more, ensuring no one was listening. Doyle wasn't just acting on his own. Gabe's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" "I've been speaking to some people, and it seems like Doyle was just the tip of the iceberg. There are powerful figures in the city who want to take your brother down." Evelyn paused for a moment, her eyes locking with Gabe's. "And they're using you as a pawn to do it." Gabe felt his pulse quicken. "Who?" Evelyn's gaze hardened. "People inside the city council, some of the older, more entrenched politicians who've had their own ways of doing things for years. They're scared of Felipe. They're scared of the reforms he's pushing through. And they'll use anything, including you, to undermine him." The weight of her words hit Gabe like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about something much deeper. "How do you know this?" Gabe asked, leaning forward. Evelyn glanced around again, ensuring they were still alone. "I have sources. People who want things to change, but are afraid of the pushback. They're scared to go public, but they know what's coming next." "What's coming next?" Gabe asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn's eyes darkened. "They're going to attack your brother's reputation, Gabe. Hard. They'll target his supporters, his allies, and anyone connected to him, especially you." Gabe clenched his fists. This was bigger than he had ever anticipated. He had thought that standing up to Doyle would make things better, but now it seemed like it had only unleashed a storm. "What can we do?" Gabe asked, his voice steady but filled with determination. Evelyn's expression softened for a moment. You need to get ahead of this. You need to expose the people behind this before they destroy everything your brothers work for." Gabe nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just his brother's career at stake anymore. It was the future of the city itself. The next few days felt like a blur. Gabe couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking through a minefield, every step potentially leading to disaster. But he knew one thing. He couldn't sit back and watch as powerful people pulled the strings behind the scenes, use his brother as a pawn in their political game. With Evelyn's help, Gabe began to dig into the people behind the smear campaign. He used his connections, his status as a mayor's brother, to reach out to allies who were willing to speak out against the corruption. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became that this was no random act of retaliation. This was a well-orchestrated conspiracy designed to take down Felipe and anyone who stood in his way. Part 10. The Rising Tide. Gabe felt like he was living in the eye of a storm. The more he uncovered about the conspiracy against his brother, the more the weight of it all pressed down on him. Evelyn had been invaluable. Her connections in the political world had given Gabe insight into the web of corruption stretching from the city council to the highest offices in the city. People were using his brother's position for their own gain, pulling the strings in the shadows. The conspiracy had been brewing for months, possibly years. The officers, the political figures, the businessmen with power and influence, none of them had expected Gabe to step in, to put everything on the line for justice. Gabe couldn't just sit back anymore. He had seen how the political machine worked, the slow grind of corruption and injustice. But this time, it wasn't just about getting by. It was about fighting for something bigger than himself, bigger than his brother, even. It was about the future of the city. He knew that with the media already on his side, the public would be a powerful ally if he could expose the truth. He just needed to make sure he was prepared for the fallout. It was time to go on the offensive. The tension had been rising between Gabe and the political elite of the city. Felipe had been on edge, knowing that his efforts to reform had earned him both fierce enemies and passionate supporters. But the enemies were organized, strategic, and they weren't afraid to use any means necessary to silence him. Gabe and Evelyn spent hours working late into the night, digging into the records, cross-referencing names, and piecing together a pattern of corruption. They'd started to track the movement of illegal funds, political favors that had been exchanged, and the shell companies that were funding some of the city's most controversial developments. But they were running out of time. The more they uncovered, the more desperate the other side became. Gabe could feel in the air. The tension was so thick it was suffocating. Felipe had already spoken about the reform he intended to bring, but the pushback was increasing, and the higher-ups were getting more brazen with their tactics. Gabe knew the next move would be a major one. "We need to expose them now, before they can act," Gabe said, pacing around his small apartment, his thoughts racing. "We can't wait any longer. They'll move faster than we can keep up with, if we don't beat them to the punch." Evelyn agreed, nodding firmly. "You're right. The clock's ticking, Gabe. They won't just stop at trying to ruin Felipe. They'll go after you next. We need a public reveal, something that shows exactly how deep this runs." The plan started to take shape. Gabe had a contact in the press, someone he trusted, an old journalist from the Linden Gazette who had been reporting on city corruption for years. He had a reputation for getting to the heart of the truth, even when the powers that be tried to keep it hidden. If anyone could help Gabe expose the conspiracy, it was him. But the problem wasn't just the exposure. It was the repercussions. Gabe knew that once the story went public, there was no going back. They would be targets. The stakes were higher than ever. The day came sooner than Gabe had anticipated. He and Evelyn had worked tirelessly to compile all the evidence they needed. The proof of corruption was irrefutable. Dozens of documents, payments, names, and shady deals all tied together. Gabe sat at his kitchen table, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed the final few words of his statement. It was a message that would be sent to the press, one that would lay out the full story, the conspiracy, the corruption, and the key players involved. He hit send, and the story went live. Immediately, his phone buzzed with notifications. The article was everywhere. Social media erupted. News channels began to pick up the story. But Gabe knew that this was just the beginning. The shockwaves from the release of the story hit the city like a tsunami. Public outcry followed swiftly, and soon the phone lines in City Hall were ringing off the hook. Gabe knew that the people would demand answers, and the people in power were scrambling to cover their tracks. However, what Gabe didn't anticipate was the immediate backlash from the political elite. People with far more influence than he realized began to take action, trying to downplay the severity of the story. They launched smear campaigns, tried to discredit Gabe, and even spread rumors about his involvement in criminal activities. But they made one mistake. They underestimated the power of the people. Felipe was thrust into the center of the storm almost immediately after the story broke. As the mayor, his reputation was now in question. His political opponents were quick to label him a failure, accusing him of being incapable of running the city without losing control to his brother's antics. Felipe knew this was coming. He knew the system would fight back. But what took him by surprise was the way the corruption had woven its way into every aspect of his life, into the city's institutions, into the very fabric of its government. Felipe addressed the media that evening in a press conference, his face stern but calm. "I will not allow these people to bring down my city," he said. "The system has been broken for far too long, and it's time for change. Gabe did the right thing by exposing this corruption, and now together we will take action." Despite the attacks on his leadership, Felipe's words struck a chord with the public. The people wanted change. They were tired of the old guard, but they also wanted justice. They wanted to see those responsible held accountable. The pressure was mounting. Gabe's revelations were just beginning. The system was about to change forever. As the days passed, the political and legal ramifications of Gabe's actions began to unfold. High-ranking officials, police officers, and businessmen who had been part of the corrupt network were now facing investigation. Doyle, who had been at the heart of the original confrontation, was suspended and under review for his actions. But just as things seemed to be moving in the right direction, an unexpected threat emerged. Gabe received a phone call late one night. It was from Evelyn. "Gabe, you need to be careful." Evelyn's voice was urgent, shaky. "They're making their final move. They're not going to let you or Felipe get away with this. They'll do whatever it takes to keep their grip on the city." Gabe felt a chill run down his spine. He had been prepared for the backlash, but not for what came next. In the dead of night, Gabe was called to a secret meeting at the city courthouse. There, in the shadows, he met with a group of allies, people who had been working behind the scenes to expose the corruption. They had gathered evidence, hidden files, and testimonies that would finally bring everything into the light. It was time for the final blow. The truth would be unleashed in a public trial, and the corrupt officials who had been controlling the city would be held accountable. The stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about Gabe and his brother anymore. It was about the future of the city. The trial began, and as Gabe stood alongside his brother Felipe, the truth began to unravel. The corrupt figures who had manipulated the system for years were exposed, one by one, and in the end, justice prevailed. Those responsible for the chaos were removed from power, and the people's voices were finally heard. The city began to rebuild, with new policies in place to prevent corruption from ever taking root again. Gabe's fight had sparked a revolution, a silent revolution, led by the people who had been silenced for so long. Gabe looked out at the crowd one final time as the sun set over the city. He had done it. They had done it. The fight's not over, Gabe whispered to himself. But today we've won. The trial was intense, filled with enough twists and turns to keep even the most seasoned lawyers on edge. Gabe sat quietly beside his brother, watching as the corruption that had plagued their city for years was laid bare before them. Every argument, every piece of evidence, and every testimony spoke to one undeniable truth. Those in power had abused their authority for far too long. It wasn't just about the money, the deals, or the broken promises. It was about the lives they had destroyed along the way. Gabe had known from the start that this would be a battle unlike any other. But sitting there now, surrounded by the way of the truth, he couldn't help but feel the surge of adrenaline that came with knowing they were on the brink of something monumental. Doyle had been the first domino to fall. He was not just a police officer. He was a symbol of the systemic rot that had festered beneath the surface of the city for years. When his involvement in the corruption came to light, it was a catalyst that set everything else into motion. With the press and public outcry on their side, it became impossible for the higher-ups to ignore the truth. The testimonies poured in one after another, each more damning than the last. Evelyn had played a crucial role in gathering the evidence, working quietly behind the scenes to piece together the connections that no one else dared to look at. The more Gabe uncovered, the more his eyes were open to the scope of conspiracy. People he had once trusted, people who had seemed to be allies, were revealed to be complicit in the web of corruption. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Gabe knew it had to be done. There was no going back now. Felipe had spent the entire trial standing firm, never once wavering in his commitment to exposing the truth. He had always known that reform would come at a high price, but it was a price he was willing to pay. As the mayor, he had been the one targeted by those who sought to protect their power. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, it became clear that the system would never be the same again. The day came when the final piece of the puzzle was revealed, a shocking document that tied the highest offices in the city to the very corruption they had been fighting against. It was a moment of reckoning for everyone involved. As the judge read the verdict, the room fell silent. The corrupt officials were sentenced to prison, their reign of manipulation and control finally over. For Gabe, the victory fell hollow at first. He had spent so much time focusing on the fight itself that he hadn't considered what life would look like afterward. The city was different now, but so was he. There was a sense of closure, yes, but also a deep realization that the fight for justice was far from over. The system may have been shaken, but it was still standing, and that meant there was still work to do. The media coverage died down, but the echoes of the trial remained in the streets. Gabe knew the city was on the brink of a new chapter. But just as quickly as the old powers had fallen, new ones would rise to take their place. The people had shown their power, but there were always forces waiting in the wings, ready to take advantage of any vulnerability. Gabe stood outside the courthouse after the trial, the setting sun casting long shadows on the pavement. Felipe stood beside him, his face tired but resolute. For a brief moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on them. "We did it," Gabe said almost to himself. Felipe nodded. "Yeah, but this is just the beginning." Gabe turned to look at his brother, feeling the truth of those words settle in. They had won this battle, but the war for justice, for change, was far from over. It was a fight they would have to keep fighting together. Gabe's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Evelyn. "The city council is ready for the reforms. The people are backing you now." Gabe's lips curled into a faint smile. This was what he had fought for. Not the fame, not the power, but the idea that people could stand together, rise above the corruption, and change the system. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick, but it was worth it. As Gabe looked up at the skyline, he couldn't help but think about all the faces of the people who had supported him. The construction workers who had lined up at his cart for churros, the commuters who had shared their stories with him, the families who had cheered when his brother took office. They had all been a part of this change. Felipe placed a hand on his shoulder. "We've got a lot of work ahead, Gabe, but this city, it's ours, and we can make it better." Gabe nodded, feeling the weight of his brother's words. Together, they could change everything. In the weeks that followed, the city began to feel the impact of the trial. The new reforms that Felipe had promised started to take shape. Transparency was no longer a buzzword. It became a reality. Public forums were held to give citizens a voice in how the city was run, and the police force underwent a much-needed overhaul. The corrupt officers who had been exposed were not just fired, they were prosecuted. The streets, once dominated by fear, now felt a little safer. But even as the city began to rebuild, Gabe couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, lurking just beneath the surface. There were murmurs of unrest. People who had supported the reforms began to notice cracks in the new system. The city had been shaken to its core, and while the corrupt had been removed, the fear of new power players taking their place lingered. It was only a matter of time before someone else would try to take control. Gabe didn't know if he was ready for that battle, but he knew one thing for sure. He would be ready for whatever came next. With Felipe by his side and the people backing him, Gabe knew that this was only the beginning of a new era. They had brought down the corrupt, But now they had to build something that would last. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, Gabe felt a sense of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, the city could be different, and that was worth fighting for. Gabe leaned against the edge of his cart, watching the people walk by. The city felt different, quieter somehow. The hum of corruption had been momentarily silenced, but there was an undercurrent of tension. Gabe had spent most of his life simply trying to get by, to survive, but now he had become a symbol of change, whether he wanted to be or not. Felipe's efforts to implement reforms were met with initial praise, but Gabe knew that the system, the old guard, would never go down without a fight. The first wave of reforms had been easy enough, but now the real work had begun. The foundations had been shaken, but not destroyed. The hard part was yet to come, ensuring that this change lasted. Gabe couldn't afford to let his guard down. The people who had orchestrated the corruption weren't simply going to slink away into the shadows. They were going to fight back, and they would do whatever it took to regain their control. The phone in his pocket buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Evelyn. "We need to meet." The message was short and cryptic, but it left Gabe with a sense of urgency. He knew better than to ignore her now. Something was happening. Something big. Gabe met Evelyn in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. The place was cozy, warm, with the aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods in the air. Evelyn was sitting by the window, looking over her shoulder, as if she was expecting someone or something to happen. "What's going on?" Gabe asked, taking a seat across from her. Evelyn leaned in, her eyes scanning the cafe as though she were checking for any eavesdroppers. "I've been getting intel on some of the players we missed." Her voice was low, her words heavy with implication. "People think the fight is over, but we're just scratching the surface." Gabe frowned. "What are you talking about?" "You and Felipe exposed the corrupt officials, but there are other figures in the shadows. Some of them have already begun working behind the scenes to undo the reforms." Evelyn's eyes darkened. "And there's one name that keeps coming up." Gabe's stomach tightened. He knew that look in her eyes. It was the look of someone who had uncovered something dangerous. "Who?" Gabe asked, leaning forward. "Richard Hale." Evelyn said the name like it was a curse. "He's been rallying the remaining power brokers, trying to rebuild the old system. He's trying to play both sides, gain favor with the city's elite, while undermining your brother's reforms." Gabe's heart sank. Richard Hale, the same man who had nearly destroyed everything his brother had worked for. How had he managed to slip under their radar? "We can't let him get away with this." Gabe said, his voice steely with determination. Evelyn nodded. "I agree, but it's not going to be easy. Hale has more connections than we thought. He's been spreading lies, stirring the pot in ways that are almost invisible to the public eye. People are starting to question whether Felipe is really the right man for the job." Gabe clenched his fists. He couldn't let this happen. He had come too far. Too much had been sacrificed for things to fall apart now. "What do we do?" Gabe asked, his voice steady. Evelyn's eyes flashed with determination. "We go after Hale, but we do it carefully. We need to expose him for who he really is. And we need to do it in a way that leaves no room for doubt." Gabe nodded. "Let's do it." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of strategy and planning. Gabe and Evelyn worked tirelessly behind the scenes, digging into Hale's activities, tracking his movements, and gathering evidence. But they quickly realized that Hale was more elusive than they had anticipated. He had learned from the mistakes of others. He wasn't going to be caught easily. Hale's empire was built on a foundation of whispers and shadows. He had cultivated relationships with the city's most powerful figures, businessmen, lobbyists, even some politicians. Every time Gabe and Evelyn thought they were getting closer, Hale would pull back into the shadows, retreating behind layers of deniability. But the cracks were starting to show. People in the city were growing restless, and the truth was slipping out. The whispers were growing louder. One day, Gabe received a call from Felipe. His brother's voice was tight, but there was a note of concern in it that Gabe hadn't heard before. "Gabe, we need to meet." Felipe's tone was urgent. "There's been a shift. Hale's not just playing games anymore. He's making moves that could put us all at risk." Gabe's mind raced. What had Hale done now? Gabe met Felipe at the mayor's office later that evening. The office was quiet, the soft hum of the city just barely audible through the glass windows. Felipe was pacing back and forth, his face etched with worry. "What happened?" Gabe asked, stepping inside. Felipe stopped pacing and turned to face his brother. "I've received word from several sources that Hale has begun making deals with some of the city's wealthiest developers." He shook his head, clearly frustrated. "They've been trying to get Felipe's policies overturned, offering backroom deals to undermine us. If we don't act fast, he could cripple everything we've built." Gabe clenched his jaw. "We need to stop him. He's already done enough damage." Felipe looked at Gabe, his eyes tired but determined. "You know what Hale is capable of. He's willing to do whatever it takes to stay in power." He paused. "But we've got something he doesn't. We've got the truth. And now it's time to use it." Gabe nodded. "Let's do it. Let's bring him down once and for all." The plan was set into motion. Gabe and Felipe knew that they had to expose Hale in a way that left no room for escape. They would use the very same system Hale had manipulated to their advantage. The truth, they knew, was a weapon that would bring him down. Days passed as the final pieces of the puzzle were put into place. Gabe and Evelyn worked in secret, meeting with key figures who had been victims of Hale's corruption. They gathered their testimonies, compiled the financial records, and prepared the final report. On the eve of the city's biggest gala, where the city's elite would gather to celebrate their so-called success, Gabe and Felipe made their final move. They had secured a meeting with several of the media outlets. It was time to go public with everything. The gala was in full swing. The city's wealthiest and most powerful people had gathered in their finest attire, sipping champagne, laughing, and discussing the future of the city. It was a celebration, one that seemed a little too grand, a little too perfect. But Gabe wasn't interested in the glamour. He was there for one reason, and one reason only, to expose Hale. Gabe and Felipe stood at the center of the ballroom, surrounded by reporters, journalists, and city officials. The media had already been briefed about the scandal, and the cameras were rolling. Gabe stepped forward, taking the microphone. The room fell silent as everyone turned their attention to him. Gabe felt the weight of every eye on him, but he wasn't nervous. This was his moment, the moment he would make the truth known. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gabe began, his voice cutting through the silence. "For too long, our city has been held hostage by corruption and greed. Tonight, that changes." He paused, looking around at the stunned faces. This was it, the final move. Tonight, we expose the truth. Richard Hale and his cronies have been using their power to line their pockets while the people suffer. They've manipulated the system for years, and it ends now. He handed over the documents to the journalists, who began to read aloud the details of Hale's involvement in the corruption. The truth was laid bare for everyone to see. Hale's face twisted with rage as the evidence unfolded before him. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The room erupted into chaos. The people, finally armed with the truth, turned on him as security escorted Hale out of the building, his face contorted with fury and disbelief. It was over. As Hale was let out, his face twisted in rage. The realization of his defeat began to sink in. The once untouchable man, whose influence had been felt in every corner of the city, was now being dragged out by security. His carefully constructed empire was collapsing under the weight of the truth. The reporters whose cameras had been recording every moment were now focused entirely on the spectacle. Richard Hale was finished. But for Gabe and Felipe, the real work was just beginning. The fight against corruption had been a battle, yes, but the war for the future of the city was far from over. Gabe could feel the eyes of the room upon him, their expressions a mix of disbelief and awe. They had seen power abused for so long that when it was stripped away, they didn't know what to do with it. But now, change was in the air. Felipe, standing beside Gabe, was calm but firm. He understood the significance of the moment. This was a turning point not just for his brother, but for the people of Linden City. For years, the system had been rigged in favor of the wealthy and powerful. But now, the people were taking back control. Gabe looked at his brother, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. "It's done." Felipe nodded, but there was no time for celebration. Not yet. We've exposed Hale, but we need to follow through. This can't just be a flash in the pan. We need to rebuild to keep the momentum going. The people need to see that the system can change. Gabe took a deep breath. I know. As the evening wore on, the city's elite continued to murmur in disbelief. Some of them had known about Hale's misdeeds, but most had turned a blind eye. Too afraid to speak out, too afraid to challenge a man who had been pulling the strings. Now, they were forced to face the reality that the truth had been revealed, and that truth would reshape everything. The next few weeks were filled with chaos, but it was a kind of chaos that came with hope. As public pressure mounted, the city council was forced to hold hearings, scrutinizing corruption that had been exposed. New laws were proposed, designed to ensure that transparency and accountability would be the new norms. The mayor's office, once seen as a figurehead, was now beginning to truly serve the people it was meant to represent. Felipe and Gabe worked tirelessly, side by side. The reforms were slow but steady, each one representing a step towards a future they wanted to create. But Gabe could see the cracks. The shadow of old power was never far behind. There were still people, even within the city council, who wanted to see them fail. One evening, Gabe sat with Felipe in his office, the two of them discussing the next steps of the city. The room was quiet, the soft of the city outside the only sound. Gabe stared out the window, lost in thought. I'm proud of what we've done, Felipe said, his voice steady. But I know the fight isn't over. Gabe nodded. It never is. Felipe's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long while, Gabe saw the weariness in his brother's eyes. Felipe had always been the strong one, the one who carried the weight of the city on his shoulders. But now he was exhausted. We've made a difference, Gabe said, his voice firm. But we can't stop now. We've come too far. Felipe looked at his brother, his face tired but resolute. You're right. We keep going. Just when things seemed to be settling, a new challenge emerged. The city had started to heal, slowly but surely, but the deeper, more insidious parts of the old system were still alive. Gabe began to hear whispers of a new group of powerful figures, ones who had been quietly working behind the scenes to undermine the reforms. They weren't the same people who had backed Hale. They were smarter, more subtle. This new group wasn't trying to exert control through brute force. They were working through influence. They were using the media, political donations, and backroom deals to pull the strings in ways that were harder to detect. Gabe and Felipe realized they couldn't afford to let their guard down. The fight against corruption wasn't just about removing one man from power. It was about ensuring that the system itself changed. Evelyn called Gabe late one night. Her voice was urgent, almost panicked. Gabe, we need to talk. What's going on? Gabe's voice was sharp, sensing the gravity in Evelyn's tone. They're back, Evelyn said. The people who've been behind all of this, they've restructured. They're forming a new coalition, and they're targeting your brother again. Gabe's heart skipped a beat. Who? He demanded, already on edge. I don't know all the details, but I'm starting to trace the connections. They're connected to some of the city's wealthiest landowners, and they're trying to work through more subtle means. Gabe's hand clenched into a fist. Not again. We'll stop them. Gabe's voice was steady. We'll do whatever it takes. The battle was far from over. Gabe and Felipe, now more determined than ever, set their sights on uncovering the new network of corruption that had taken root in the city. This time, they knew they couldn't just go after a few bad apples. They had to root out the entire system. They began meeting in secret, their every move watched by unseen eyes. Evelyn, still their ally, had managed to infiltrate some of the circles where the new coalition operated, and her information proved invaluable. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Gabe couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the moment they exposed a new conspiracy, there would be consequences far worse than before. Felipe, too, had begun to feel the pressure. As the mayor, he was now more vulnerable than ever. People had started to whisper about his inability to control the city's growth, about his brother's influence on the reforms. The whispers were growing louder, and soon they would turn into a roar. But Gabe wouldn't back down. He couldn't. We've already exposed one monster. Gabe said one night as he and Felipe sat in the mayor's office, looking over documents. We'll expose this one too. Felipe nodded, determination in his eyes. We do this together, Gabe. This city belongs to the people, not to them. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. The new coalition had moved quickly, and by the time Gabe and Felipe realized what was happening, they had already secured key positions of power. Gabe knew it was time to act. It was no longer just about exposing corruption. It was about taking control of the city's future. Gabe had always known that he couldn't do it alone, but now he had allies in unexpected places. Citizens who had seen the truth, workers who had stood with him from the very beginning, and even former allies of Hale who had begun to realize that the system needed to change. The showdown took place in the city's grandest hall, where the politicians and power brokers gathered to decide the city's future. Gabe and Felipe were there, not as outsiders, but as leaders of a movement that could not be stopped. With the evidence in hand, Gabe stood at the front of the room, facing the city's elite. He had done the impossible before, but this time, he knew the stakes were higher than ever. This time, he wasn't just fighting for his brother, for himself, or for justice. He was fighting for the soul of the city. The room was silent. This was their moment. Felipe stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. This is our city. The power shifted. The reforms, now backed by the truth and the people, were about to become the new foundation of Linden City. The city hall was silent, the tension in the room so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Gabe stood at the front, his heart pounding as he watched the faces of the city's elite. The time for compromise was over. The power they had wielded for so long was slipping through their fingers, and they knew it. Felipe, standing beside him, spoke first. His voice was calm but carried the weight of the responsibility he had borne for so many years. This is not just about the reforms we started. Felipe's words echoed through the room. This is about what kind of city we want to build. Do we want to live in a place ruled by fear, greed, and corruption? Or do we want a city where justice and fairness are the foundation? There was a murmur of disagreement from some of the older members of the council, those who had been part of the system for years, those who had quietly benefited from the status quo. But their voices were drowned out by the rising chorus of support from the people who had come to stand by Gabe and Felipe. Gabe could see the fear in their eyes, the fear of losing everything they had worked so hard to control. But he couldn't let that stop him. He couldn't back down, not when so much was on the line. This isn't about me or Felipe, Gabe continued, his voice steady but full of conviction. It's about the people, the ones who live in the shadows of your skyscrapers, the ones who are ignored until it's time to vote or pay taxes, the ones who don't have a voice until now. The room fell into a stunned silence as Gabe's words sank in. He knew they were powerful men, capable of buying their way out of any situation. But there was one thing they could never buy, the truth. And the truth was on his side. One of the older council members, a man Gabe had always respected, stood up. His name was Harold Jenkins, a veteran politician who had once been an ally to Felipe but had grown disillusioned with the political system. He was a man who, over the years, had seen too many of his colleagues fall prey to the same temptations of power and greed. I've been around long enough to know when the system is broken, Jenkins said, his voice raw with emotion. I've seen the way things work around here. I've turned a blind eye for too long, but I can't do that anymore. Gabe's right. The people have spoken. The room seemed to hold its breath as Jenkins stepped forward. I move that we start an immediate investigation into the corruption that has plagued this city for so long. We will expose the truth, no matter how far up it goes. For the first time since the meeting began, Gabe allowed himself to breathe. The tide was turning. The people, the ones who had been afraid to speak out, were finally being heard. And now, with Jenkins' support, they had the power to dismantle the old system piece by piece. In the days that followed, the investigation into corruption that had run rampant in Linden City began to gain momentum. The names of the corrupt officials were released one by one. Some resigned quietly, while others were dragged to the public humiliation they had so desperately tried to avoid. But it wasn't just the politicians who were exposed. The media began to report on the business leaders, the powerful landowners, and even members of the police force who had turned a blind eye or actively participated in the city's rampant corruption. Gabe and Felipe knew that this wasn't a clean victory. The system didn't just break overnight. It was a slow, painful process of exposing the truth, piece by piece. But each revelation was a victory, and with every exposed name, the walls of the old system cracked. The public support for Felipe surged as it became clear that he wasn't just another politician. He was a man willing to stand up against the forces that had controlled the city for far too long. And Gabe, once just a humble street vendor, had become a symbol of justice, a symbol of how one person could spark change. Months passed. The city, though scarred by its past, began to rebuild. The public trust that had once been lost was slowly restored. Gabe and Felipe, though tired from the battle they had fought, knew that their work wasn't finished. Felipe, now fully committed to his vision of reform, worked with the council to implement new laws that would prevent corruption from ever taking root again. Police forces were retrained. City contracts were now publicly disclosed, and the citizens were given a voice in how their city was run. But it wasn't just about passing laws. It was about changing the culture. Gabe understood that now. The old guard had fallen, but if the city wasn't careful, the same mistakes could happen again. It was up to the people to ensure that the system stayed fair, that those who held power never forgot who they were meant to serve. Gabe found himself at the forefront of the change. He had become an advocate for the people, working alongside Felipe to make sure the reform stayed in place. It wasn't an easy path. There were still those who tried to resist, those who didn't want to give up their control. But Gabe knew that with each step forward, they were building a better future for everyone. One day, as Gabe stood outside his cart, the familiar scent of churros filling the air, he looked out at the city that had been transformed. The streets were cleaner, the buildings had been restored, and there was a sense of hope in the air that hadn't been there before. People walked by, their faces filled with a quiet pride. The city was no longer controlled by the old forces. It was controlled by the people, by the ones who had fought for change. Gabe smiled to himself. He had done it, but more importantly, they had done it together. Felipe, the people, and even Gabe, who had once been just a man trying to make a living, had become part of something greater. They had changed their city. They had changed their future. Gabe's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Evelyn. "We've got it. The final piece. Hale's entire network has been dismantled. There's nothing left for them to hide behind." Gabe's heart swelled with pride. The fight wasn't over, but the victory was theirs. As Gabe stood there, watching the city bustle around him, he felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had done everything he could to make things right, and now, the city would carry the torch forward. The work wasn't done. But for the first time, Gabe knew that the people had the power, and they would never let it slip away again.